And here we go again. It is another week, and that means there's another episode of Stand Up Explained. I am one of your hosts, Brant Tobler.
I'm Andrew Slater. Sorry, I had to burp right there.
And that is the burping Andrew Slater, as he's known on these comedy streets. We are glad to be back. Hope you guys are doing good. We missed you for 1 week, but we have to get shit done. It's a pandemic, but hopefully you guys have learned a lot, did some shows. And you know what? I'm going to plug a show real quick. I realize this because I hope you guys are enjoying all this free content. If you are, go buy our live streams. I'm doing a live stream, Comedy Works. I'm headlining Comedy Works August 13th. It's $10. So wherever in the world you're watching this, if you want to help out as a thank you for all this free shit we're doing for you guys, feel free to do it. And if you don't have $10, then don't do it. But I'm just throwing it out there. If you want to see me make all the mistakes on stage that I tell you guys not to do on this podcast, feel free to go to comedyworks.com on August 13th.
Yes, definitely go to comedyworks.com, buy the live stream of Brant, and you can learn from the Jedi Master. No, but it's funny because I don't know about you, but I think we've both done a lot of these virtual shows or whatever. And so it's really interesting because, you can still see how many people come. They still tell it's just like a regular show. Like there'll be a little number. In fact, it's even worse than a real show. Cause like you can kind of lie to yourself in a dark room. Like, yeah, there's like 50 people there. I think we seat like 60 and we filled it up, whatever. But on these Zoom shows or virtual shows, where there's like a little number right at the top, tells exactly how many people there the entire show. So there's no lying to yourself, and you have an unlimited supply of people. You think the whole country could come to the whole world could come to this show, right? But you still get like the same numbers. It's incredible. But there's just like somehow there's like there's like an agreed upon limit of how many people are allowed to attend a comedy show.
Well, the other thing is when they leave a comedy show, I tell myself they're going to the bathroom or they got to take a call or something. But when they leave the Zoom room, I know they're never coming back.
No.
That means they're going, see you later.
That's a statement to leave the Zoom room, because you could just leave, like you said, you could just leave your computer on and go to a better show. You could just go out, watch Netflix. You could watch a better comedian, but that's
what we're talking about today on this episode: protecting comedians' egos in Zoom shows. No, what we are actually going to talk about is something that's been debated for a long time, and that is: do you have to have a miserable childhood to be funny? I've heard it. I think we both have our opinions on this, and it's something that's been
the sad clown debate.
Yeah. And we can. Those of you that don't know us, I had an awful childhood, and Andrew had a wonderful childhood, and Andrew is much funnier than me. So podcast over.
No,
we answered the question.
No, but I get that a lot. I've gotten constantly, oh, what do you have to joke? Or, I mean, I had a good childhood. I didn't have anything like especially magical about it, or didn't grow up like rich or anything, but it was just a nice childhood. Everything kind of went okay, so people usually, when they think of comics, I think in like the mainstream media, they love the story of like portraying them as like, oh, there was this crazy trauma and the only way you could deal with it is with humor, and so you develop the sense of humor to the point where you were like a professional comedian.
Yeah. Well, what did they always say? What is the thing? It's comedy, or pain plus time equals comedy.
Tragedy plus time equals comedy. Yeah, we should probably know this. Yeah, tragedy
that's how much
plus time equals comedy.
Well, you can already tell we don't believe in it. Tragedy plus time. I mean, that's something people said, and I will say this: I did use comedy because I did have some rough times in my childhood, and I did use comedy to kind of deflect that or distract me from that. But a lot of people have said to me, hey, that know my past, they've said that, hey, I had a pretty good childhood. Can I still be a comedian? And I'm like, yeah, of course. Here's the main point I'll say. Why I think it's attributed to that is comedy's hard. It's very hard. And you go through so many ups and downs. So I feel like some of the people that went through ups and downs earlier in life tend to stick with it more because that's why I think there's a That's why I think there's a comparison between a bad childhood and staying with comedy, because I don't. That's the only thing that for me, it's like, okay, when comedy has gotten hard, I can always revert back to my childhood and go, okay, it got hard there, and I got through that. But by no means do I think it's. And other people have harder college experience or something. I think that's the only thing I would say that kind of they have in common is just if you can get through the ups and downs before you get into comedy, it might help you stick around in comedy when the ups and downs come instead of just quit.
That's a great point. I never thought about it like that, but you're right. Not only that, are you used to the ups and downs and you can stick with it, but like if you had a great childhood, right, and then you go to college and you get a great education and everything goes right and you goes to plan and you get married and you have kids and you have a great job, those people are going to be less likely to get into comedy because why
Yeah.
why would they in a million years risk all of that, to give? That's much harder to give up. There's examples of it, but there's a lot fewer examples of like the person giving up the high paying job and risking their family's like welfare going forward and all that stuff to then go pursue stand up. So like if you have less to lose, and the great thing about stand up too is that it's like a no entry fee sort of game. It's not like improv or acting where you need a bunch of money up front to take classes and get headshot. Stand up, you can just show up and go up,
Yeah.
and so it's open to basically anybody of any sort of economic situation. So like I think that might be a reason too. I'd never really thought about that, but just as you said that right there, it occurred to me like, yeah, like people with rougher upbringings are going to be attracted to stand up because it allows you to do it. I mean, the stand up just doesn't really discriminate that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I see what you're saying there is everything else does cost money. It's
Right.
I mean, it's like something to compare it to sports is a lot of times you're like, they compare like why inner city kids don't play baseball and they play basketball, because to play basketball you just need one ball and there's courts all over. With baseball you have to buy all the stuff, you have to sign up for a league, someone has to take you to practice. And I
Exactly.
didn't think of that point either. It's like you're right. Well, as long as you can show up, you can go up and you're part of this.
Baseball is like improv.
Yeah.
and stand-up's like basketball. All you need is the ball, and stand-up
Yeah.
all you need is the microphone. But yeah, so that's a great point. I hadn't really thought of that until now. I think when people say that to me, they go, well, first of all, you're like, well, then why did I get into? I think because I got into stand-up so early, it allowed me to really have nothing to risk by going into it, and
Mm-hmm.
I just loved stand-up, and I started like while I was in college, and so I wasn't really thinking like, oh, is it my career? Am I going to give up a career to pursue this, or this is kind of risky? Why would I do this? It didn't even like occur to me. It was just like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to go try and do it. But
Yeah.
people will say that to me a lot. Like, oh, well, what do you have to joke about, or what, and it's like the same shit that everybody had. Anything that occurs to me that is funny. Like I think the reason why sometimes people go, oh, all comics are joke about have this pain that they joke about, is because the comics who are in pain are like uncommonly honest about it. So you just hear about it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's like, I mean, it goes back to that thing, tragedy plus time equals comedy, but that's not the only way you get to comedy.
Right.
I mean, people have told jokes about, or like a lot of my stories are about some of the rough times I had with my father, but a lot of my stories are far from tragedy plus time. It was like alcohol plus chaos equals comedy, or like, but
Yeah.
none of those sayings get the credit that tragedy, for some reason, that one, which I still think came from like the theater or something else, but like, I
Well,
don't think there's
it's
any
like kind of
equation.
like I think it's a kind of like a beautiful narrative, like allows people to justify the tragedy. They go, oh no, if you can spin it into something really funny, or if you can laugh at the pain, then it was all worth it in a way, or and that's true. It's true that you can make stuff super funny out of sad situations, but like you said, it doesn't have to be a sad situation in the
No.
first place to become funny.
And I think comedy's progressed so much that it's like a lot now. I mean, there's no rules in comedy, like we've said on here. Like anybody can be a comic at any time. I mean, half the comics we know started out one gender and are a different gender now. Like they,
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
do anything. There's no.
No, and you can be old. Like me, my wife and I were talking about this. She went to college for like broadcast journalism, right? And she said, "Oh, there was this guy in my class, and he was a natural. He was so good, and he was one of these people you're like for sure he's going to be on ESPN or on NBC doing the news, whatever." And then he got married, had a kid in college all at the same time, and then had this. He was a manager at Target, and then just after college, he just stayed managing that Target and just never pursued. And she was like, "Yeah, it's just such a shame." And I was like, "He could go do it right now. There's nothing really stopping him." Of course, I'm
Yeah,
not talking about stand up with him. I'm talking about this broadcasting, but there it really isn't anything stopping him from right now going and pursuing that thing, except for he just has decided not to. Maybe he doesn't want to do it, whatever. But we were talking about it like, he could have had it and he missed his chance. It's like, I don't believe in that. And the same thing with stand up. Like you can start, you don't need a certain background to do it. You don't need money to do it. You don't need it doesn't have to be while you're young. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to wait until you're a certain age to do it. That's the beautiful thing about stand up. It's just
yeah.
wide open to anybody at any time.
Well, let me tell you something. The Eagles, the famous band, wrote a song about stand-up comedy and called Hotel California. And I think they say you can check in anytime you like, but you can never leave. And that is stand-up comedy,
Yeah,
right? Because I
that's
mean,
true. That
as
is
you were saying
absolutely
that,
true.
those lyrics came into my head, and I was like, "You're right. You can start this whatever you want. You just can never quit it." But I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of people that'll probably click on this video and have had those thoughts like, I had a good childhood. I can't be funny, and it's so not true.
I know. I used to watch like the old stand up, like the roasts, Rickles and Dean Martin and Carson and stuff. And I'd listen to these like old interviews with Mel Brooks, and a lot of it was about being Jewish and growing up Jewish and getting teased or bullied in school, or a lot of Catholic stuff and being different, or if you were black, getting profiled and people were racist against you, and then they had their mom was in trouble or their dad was in trouble, and it was all these like things that they talked about that created their story. And then that's how they became funny, or they got picked on and they learned how to deal with it, and that's how they became funny. And I used to get so discouraged because I would hear those things. I go, I don't really have anything like that. Like my
Yeah,
life seems so boring. I didn't grow up in New York and worried about getting stabbed on the way to school. I didn't have any of that. But then as you get older and you realize like Mel Brooks wasn't funny because of how he grew up. He was funny because he was a funny person.
yeah,
And, he was smart and he worked hard and worked on his craft. I mean, it's way more that than how you grow up.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. I mean, like this one's bad right now, but before, if you go back to 2019, I mean, Chris D'Elia, it's known he came from like a silver spoon. His dad's like a huge producer. I think Nick Kroll's dad's like a billionaire or something. There's
Yeah.
like there's plenty of now, but I feel like those comics would try to hide that. You know what? On both those, I think that shit that came out way later because they bought into the narrative of like
Well,
no one
nobody
can
likes
hear
that
that.
story. That
What's that?
nobody likes that story. Nobody wants to
Yeah,
hear like the rich kid made good.
yeah, yeah. No, that's true.
Because
I
you're
mean,
like,
that is true.
yeah, nobody wants. So it's like they probably are shy to talk about it because it's like everyone's gonna hate me if they know I had it so easy. Or it's like anybody wants to like exaggerate the toughness of their upbringing or their story. But the one thing I'll say about trauma or tragedy or whatever, it's like I find that not most I because as I've gotten older, things have happened that have been tough in my life. Like things that were way tougher than anything I dealt with growing up or in my childhood. But then I have not ever really turned those into comedy. But while somewhat what happens is sometimes while that stuff's happening, it focuses you more than I've ever been focused before on comedy. It's like weird, but it's in a
Yeah.
way you think that stuff would hinder you, but it doesn't all the time. So it's like, and I didn't even use it. I didn't even use it or turn it into anything that I've done so far with stand up or comedy.
Well, yeah. Well, that's a great point too, is like, and a lot of us have gone through trauma with people in our lives that we care about, that we could turn it into comedy, but maybe we wouldn't feel comfortable. There's been plenty of people in my life when I was like, oh, I could talk about this, but this person comes to the show and I can't do,
Yeah.
it's like,
Or
I
just
don't,
deep down, it's like, it's not my story to tell,
Yeah.
it's like, and yeah, this affected me, but I'd be putting too much of them out there to talk about this on stage or whatever the reason is. It's just, the other thing is you might come from that. I guess what I'm trying to say is you might come from trauma, anyone listening to this, and you might go, oh, that's my thing. I've got to use, you don't even have, just because you come from trauma doesn't mean you have to use that as your fuel for a comedian. You can just still do silly stuff if that's what you like and what you feel like doing. There's no need. I mean, I think we touched on this in another episode, but you don't have to use that fuel if you don't think that that's you.
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, I think the only thing that gets credit for the trauma is if you have the childhood trauma, is what that's the stereotype. But let me tell you something, when you get into this, you'll get your trauma if you didn't have it as a kid. Exactly. Or even for like you said, you had a lot of stuff out of your control happen that became hard for you, but there's no timeline on the trauma. That doesn't mean my childhood trauma is different than your adult trauma. It's like, I guess it can, but that's I guess what we're talking about is just don't think you have to have your trauma as a kid, because everyone in life's going to have trauma at some point. Probably.
There's no shortage of trauma.
But
if you get into stand up, you're going to find it eventually.
Yeah.
I guess that's the point.
But I think you nailed it too when you were talking about how everyone wants to hear the underdog story. For me, comedy is like the Olympics. And if you watch the Olympics, you never want to hear about the rich kid from Santa Monica whose dad put him in tennis lessons from 4 years old. And now of course he's winning the gold medal. You want to hear about the kid that made a tennis racket out of a broom and now he's fighting for his life to be, that's the shit that's the story you want to hear. And that's so, I'm glad you said that, because it's something I talk about with my girlfriend all the time. When she's like, someone cheated or something, I go, yeah, but there's a million people that don't cheat, but that's like the train on the tracks. We never talk about the train going from destination A to B. We only talk when the train crashes. And I think if you really examined all the comics, so many of the trains just went from A to B and they're funny anyway, but that's not fun to talk about. You just want to hear the train crash.
And a lot of times, so I think a lot of times you get into this and you look at other comedians that you like or you admire, and you go, well, how did they do it? How did they get into it? Where did they grow up? Where are they from? What are their parents like? And sometimes you look at them and you go, oh, this person's like me. But then you see some interview and they're like, well, actually, dad was super distant and this is that. And you're like, oh, I can't relate to that. But then sometimes you also realize, like, they've been giving this interview 5,000 times in their life about and the interviewer's pushing them. And if you really sat down and you really thought about your childhood, there probably were some traumatic moments you could dig up if you had to. Not everybody's dad, like goes to prison, and sometimes it's more subtle than that. It's like dad just wouldn't say I love you or something, or they wouldn't hug him or whatever. It's like that's like the more normal dad stuff that the comedians use, to then create. But it's like sometimes that stuff gets blown out of proportion, or not blown out of proportion, but just like you don't understand that you have your own experiences, whatever they are, whether they're good, bad, indifferent, and maybe they're more subtle than somebody else's experiences, but you can still use those.
Well, if we're being honest, like, my childhood gets glamorized for being awful, but really it wasn't that bad, because my dad went to prison and I did have some tough moments, but I did have a good stepdad. And it wasn't like, but again, I figured out stand-up, and I mentioned my stepdad but that's not, like, just like you said, like, if you watch my stand-up, and I've said this in interviews and stuff, and people are like, man, you've had it awful. Or even in my book, I say, you know what? I really didn't have it that bad because my stepdad was great. And I come from a small town and the community knows what my dad was. So in hindsight, I didn't realize it, but teachers and coaches, everybody took care of me. But I also realized what worked for me was talking about the trauma, just like we talked about. So it was, I'm the exactly what you're saying. My shit was glamorized way more than, and by my own choice, because it helped my career to talk about the crazy shit and bring up the crazy shit way more than it really affected me as a kid, honestly.
But that's a great point too, because like you said, you talk about your dad going to prison. I know your act. So it's like, I know you have like X many jokes about your dad going to prison, but then you also talk about your stepdad in your act, and you have probably just as many jokes about your stepdad, who was lovely and just had a funny name, than you do about your dad who goes to prison, So it's like both those things you have jokes about. Both of them get laughs, equal amounts. I think you have just as many on each topic. But one was like a super positive influence in your life, and one was more negative. But like, so it just shows you can draw humor from both.
Yeah.
Right there. Just in that example.
Yeah. And if I wouldn't have, I don't think I was funny because of the trauma in my life. I think people are, I mean, I don't know, that's another question for if you're born funny or you're not, but I don't think if my dad would have been there, I wouldn't have been funny. I would liked, because none of the trauma stuff made me, first of all, I hid all the trauma stuff until much later in my life, but I was funny as a kid, like I got class clown in junior high, class clown in high school. I was always the funny guy, but nobody knew about my past. So it wasn't like I was taking the bad stuff in my life and making it funny. I was being funny just because I was funny, and I was hiding all that shit.
So then somebody would say, they would go, well, you weren't talking about it, but the reason why you were funny is because you used humor as like a defense mechanism to deal with everything else. And I think what both of our opinions are is like, maybe, yes, but then there's a lot of people out there who we know, and they take our stuff out of it. Just take us out of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people we know who are super funny, and they didn't need a defense mechanism. You know what I mean? They were perfectly fine.
Wait, let's go the other way. I know a lot of people that have been through a lot of trauma, and they are not funny at all. That's how we disprove this. Think of all the people that have been through the worst shit around you. I bet they are so unfunny.
Yeah, there's so many unfunny refugees out there. You would not believe. It's like boring.
Every one of my adopted friends is just not funny at all. It's like, figure it out. Your parents hated you. Can't you make that funny?
Right. You should have come up with this defense mechanism.
That is such a great point there. Because if that's the case, shit, everybody. So we're going to come out of this pandemic. Everyone's going to be super funny.
Everyone's going to be hilarious.
It's a wrap.
Yeah. No, I think it is true. It's like, again, that would be a whole episode. It's like, are you born funny or do you learn it or whatever? But whatever the answer to that is, it's not defined by how much trauma you've had in your life. Let's just put it that way. Like, it's not like if you have X amount happen to you, you're going to be Y amount funny, something, there's a million other things that go into it. And so you shouldn't ever, I guess the whole point of this, or my point, what I would want people to take away from this is, you should never go, oh, this comedian can be a comedian because they had so much stuff happen to them that was bad. Like they've earned it or something. And I couldn't become a comedian because what's really happened to me.
Yeah. Well, we both have gained our success talking about our past, which we tell you guys on here all the time. Talk about your experience. Talk about, some of my favorite jokes are about your mom just being hilarious, being super sweet, or like the ham pants and all that. But it's a different kind of trauma. I wouldn't even say that. You can take trauma a lot of different ways too. Like stuff your mom did that was embarrassing at the time. Embarrassment can be traumatic when you're a kid, but that could be like, there's so much funny if you can find the funny in your own life, in your own childhood, whether it was good or bad, I think.
Yeah. And like we said, I think just there's a there's a misconception. I think it gets strengthened by like it's just an easy media narrative when people interview comedians, but there's definitely a misconception that like it's some sort of unifying thing among all comedians, that they all had something horrible happen to them. And I just don't think that's true. For some it is true, but it's definitely not like all comedians you've ever heard of
Yeah.
had like an
Yeah.
awful childhood.
Just think about whatever profession you have. There's some people there that had bad lives and good lives. Just comedy's the only one where it gets glamorized like that.
Well, and anything in comedy, it's more diverse, right? Because in stand up, at least, it's more diverse because, like we said, it's an equal opportunity employer, really. I mean, in some ways it's not, but at least in the very early stages, open mics are open, you know, people sign up, and it's as close as to a meritocracy as you're going to get in entertainment, I think. Like really, really funny people are going to rise up eventually, you know? And so, other industries aren't like that. You know, it's like you look at like CEOs, there's not a ton of trauma in those backgrounds.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of rich dads in those backgrounds, a lot of rich parents in those backgrounds, a lot of juniors, you know, end up being CEOs, you know? So it's just different. And in that way, I think stand-up's actually like kind of unique.
Yeah.
But
so yeah, I think we answered it right. If you want to be funny, just listen to this podcast, regardless of what happened to you as a child. That's all. We've given you the cheat code. This is it. Just if you had a good childhood, if you had a bad childhood, either way, just keep listening to this podcast, and you will do Zoom shows with us one day.
And don't feel like you have to invent. Some comedians felt the need to have to invent trauma.
Yeah.
to make their story more interesting or something, and
so
don't feel the need you have to do that, because that usually catches up with you and eventually. So
if you don't know what he's talking about, there's been a few comics that have lied and said that there was a famous comic who said he was part of 9/11, and then come to find out
one of the victims, not one of the perpetrators.
Yeah, one of the victims of 9/11, that he said he was in the Twin Towers the day that they fell. So, and then needless to say, that came out later, and he was just trying. He bought into the
I think
tragedy
that's true.
plus
Don't
time.
you think that's probably part of why he?
For sure,
right? Because he thought, oh, my story's too boring. I need something to like talk about in interviews or something.
Yeah, he was on. I mean, he's on Howard Stern. Howard Stern's notorious for having these crazy interviews. He just like, fuck it. No one wants to hear the train. Let me tell this train wreck story, but I mean, it cost him millions of dollars. So anyway, don't create it. Just be yourself. Talk about whatever it is. If you work on the unique experiences wherever you're from, weird shit your parents did, the good shit, the bad shit, people want to hear your take about your life, and it definitely doesn't have to be bad. And that's a great point. I'm glad you said that, because I've had it happen enough around me, because my shit's been bad or labeled as bad, that I've seen people be like, they weren't being themselves. They were really mining for something bad and trying to really make like make a stub toe into a broken leg. Like, no, just tell us how you stubbed your toe. You don't have to say it was trauma.
Yeah. Lean into whatever your own actual experiences are, but don't feel discouraged if you don't have like the rap sheet or whatever.
Yeah, because you don't need it. Just be yourself. But all right, I think that's good. We got it.
I think we got it.
You got anything else?
No. I'm trying to think of anything traumatic.
I think we nailed
it. That I could blow up into being.
Are we recording?
Are we recording?
It would be dramatic if we did this whole episode and it didn't record. That would be real traumatic.
No, I had the plumber here earlier. That was traumatic.
That's traumatic. Yeah, there'll be trauma in your comedy life. Don't trust me. The first time you get a paycheck, you're gonna have plenty of trauma in this comedy. But keep going. All right, guys, we love you. Hopefully, this answered your question. If you're starting comedy, if you're out there thinking about doing comedy, do not let anything stop you. More or less, your childhood, whether it is good or bad. Please rate, subscribe, review to the podcast. Tell your friends. We only gain traction when you guys tell your friends, and I've seen you guys tell in comics, and I've gotten a lot of messages, and you guys have sent in questions, so we're going to get to those questions in the upcoming episodes. So hope you guys had fun today, and we can't wait to do shows with you on the same stage one day. So that's it for now. I'm Brant Tobler.
I'm Andrew Slater.
We'll see you next week.